In southeastern Poland, where the plain flattens until it seems almost horizontal, and pine forests close off the horizon in dark, even lines, there is a place that for decades had no sign, no monument, and no official name on any tourist map. A plot of just under 10 hectares, surrounded by farmland, with a railway line that still passes only a few meters away. The trains still go by. The sound of the wagons is still the same sound. And beneath the ground, spread across pits that archaeologists have still not fully mapped, lie the remains of between 430,000 and 500,000 people. Most of them died within a span of 9 months. Some, less than 2 hours after stepping off the train. Belzec is not Auschwitz. It does not have the fame, the documentary volume, or the cultural weight that the world associates with the Holocaust when it closes its eyes. Belzec came earlier. It was smaller in area, and proportionally far more efficient in terms of deaths per square meter and per unit of time. It was, in the technical terms that the perpetrators themselves used in their reports, a pure extermination camp. There were no barracks for permanent slave labor. There was no prisoner registry. There were no tattooed numbers. The process allowed for no intermediate stage between arrival and death. Of the hundreds of thousands who entered, only 7 survived. 7 people. During the entire time the camp was operational. From March 1942 until the end of that same year, with some residual activity continuing into the summer of 1943, 7 human beings managed to get out alive and tell something of what had happened. One of them was murdered before he could finish his testimony. Another took decades to speak. The others died without anyone ever fully hearing them. This is the story of that place. It all began in a meeting for which no complete minutes exist. On January 20th, 1942, in a villa beside Lake Wannsee, on the outskirts of Berlin, 15 Reich officials sat around a table to coordinate what later documents would call the final solution to the Jewish question. It was not at that meeting that the decision to murder the Jews of Europe was made. That decision had already been made. It was already underway. What was coordinated at Wannsee was logistics. Who would handle what, in what order, with what resources, and in which territories. It was a management meeting, not an ideological debate. The men who sat there were not discussing whether they should do it. They were dividing the workload. Reinhard Heydrich chaired the meeting. Adolf Eichmann took notes. Among those present were state secretaries, SS chiefs from different regions, and representatives of the Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of Justice. When they were finished, the organizational question had been settled. The Jews of occupied Polish territory, the general government as the Germans called it, would be exterminated within its own borders. There would be no mass deportations to some undefined east. The work would be done right there. Months before that meeting, Odilo Globoknik had already received instructions. Globoknik was the SS and police leader in the Lublin district, a 42-year-old Austrian who had demonstrated boundless ambition and a complete willingness to carry out any task assigned to him. In October 1941, Heinrich Himmler had given him a direct order: build the Reich's first extermination camp on Polish territory. The target was the Jewish population of the general government, which at that time numbered slightly more than 2 million people. Globoknik chose Christian Wirth to carry out the technical side. Wirth had experience. He had taken part in Aktion T4, the euthanasia program that between 1939 and 1941 had murdered more than 70,000 people with physical and mental disabilities in 6 special centers inside Germany. Wirth knew how to kill on a large scale, how to build the procedure, how to manage the corpses. He was a pragmatic man, cold and brutally efficient. His subordinates called him Christian the Terrible. It was a nickname he did not reject. In November 1941, the first teams arrived at Belzec, a village on the Lublin-Lvov railway line, in the southeastern edge of the general government. The location was not chosen at random. The railway was essential. The village was far enough from major urban centers not to draw immediate attention. The land was flat and easy to dig, and there was a small pre-existing military installation from which they could begin. Construction began in December 1941. The workers were mainly local Jews recruited by force. Some of them, without knowing it, were building the place where they would die. The camp that took shape during those first weeks was, seen from the outside, remarkably simple. A double barbed wire fence interwoven with branches and vegetation blocked visibility from the outside. Inside, there were two separate zones. The first, closer to the railway, was the reception area, the arrival platform, the barracks where prisoners were stripped of their belongings and clothing, and the rooms where women's hair was cut. The second zone, at the far end, separated by another fence and connected to the first by a narrow corridor that the guards called the tube, contained the gas chambers. In the first phase of the camp, that corridor led to a wooden building with 3 chambers. Each chamber measured approximately 4 meters by 8. They could hold, packed to the physical limit of what a human body occupies in space, between 150 and 200 people. The killing mechanism was an engine that produced carbon monoxide. The gas was channeled directly into the chambers through pipes. In the first months of operation, the process was slow, erratic, and mechanically problematic. The engines failed. The bodies took longer to die than calculated. The chambers did not seal properly. Worth and his team adjusted, repaired, modified. In its initial phase, the camp was a laboratory of murderous engineering, where the measure of success was the time between entry and confirmed death. The first convoy arrived at Belzec on March 17, 1942. It transported Jews from the city of Lubacho. There were about 2,000 people. They stepped off the train at the platform and were led to the reception barracks with the instruction that they were going to be disinfected before being transferred to work zones in the east. That was the standard story, repeated in the Operation Reinhard extermination camps because it worked. People wanted to believe it. They wanted to believe that the process had a purpose other than immediate death. That margin of disbelief was the most effective instrument the perpetrators had for maintaining order during the process. Within a few hours, those 2,000 people were dead. More trains arrived in the following days. From Zolkiw, from Lublin, from small towns and villages in southeastern Poland. The process was always the same. The train stopped outside the camp installations. The wagons were uncoupled in groups and pushed by a small shunting locomotive onto the inner platform. The doors opened. People stepped out, often in a state of extreme exhaustion, after days locked inside without water and with little ventilation. The guards, a mixture of SS personnel and Ukrainian auxiliaries recruited at the Troniki prisoner of war camp, directed the flow. Men in one direction, women and children in another. The instructions were precise and repeated aloud. Leave your suitcases here, your valuables there. Remember where you left your things so you can retrieve them afterward. Remember your luggage number. Keep your valuables inside your shoes. It was a system designed to create a concrete task that occupied people's minds for the time needed to move them toward the next point in the process. The human mind tends to cling to the immediate detail when terror is too great to process. The luggage number, the pair of shoes, the folded note in a pocket, those small objects functioned as an anchor, as proof that there would be an afterward. Then came the Weg zur Badesanstalt, the path to the baths. A dirt walkway about 100 meters long, flanked by wire and stakes driven into the ground, with guards along the sides. It was narrow, deliberately narrow, so people could only move forward in rows of 3 or 4. At the end of the path stood the wooden building with the 3 doors. The first months of operation at Belzec coincided with mass deportations from different ghettos in the Lublin district, the Krakow district, and Galicia. Arrival numbers quickly exceeded the camp's technical capacity in its initial configuration. The original 3 chambers were not enough. The system for removing bodies was slow and physically unsustainable. In June 1942, Worth decided to temporarily halt operations and rebuild the camp. He had the wooden building demolished. He had new pits dug. He had a new building constructed, this time more solid, with 6 chambers instead of 3. Each chamber measured approximately 4 meters by 8, and the new structure included a better ceiling system, wider pipes, and enough capacity to process several thousand people per day. During the reconstruction period, some deportations were temporarily redirected to Sobibor. When Belzec became operational again, in August 1942, it was considerably more efficient than it had been in its first phase. Rudolf Reder was 56 years old when he arrived at Belzec in August 1942. He was a soap manufacturer from Lvov, a businessman, a father, a husband. When he was deported, he did not know where he was being taken. When the train stopped and the doors opened, the smell was the first thing that struck him. A smell he had never experienced before and could not immediately identify. It was the smell of mass decomposition, of earth repeatedly turned over above pits that never fully closed. Rita was one of the men separated from the main group at the moment of arrival. The guards were looking for useful workers, mechanics, carpenters, men with trades. Rita spoke. He said he was a manufacturer, that he could work. He was assigned to the camp's Sonderkommando, the group of prisoners forced to perform the physical labor of extermination, to extract corpses from the chambers, to empty pockets, to pull out gold teeth, to carry the bodies to the pits. He lived in that state for 3.5 months, 3.5 months in which he saw train after train arrive, in which he counted, as best he could, as someone doing the only thing he could do to preserve some form of consciousness, the bodies that passed through his hands. What Reeder described in his testimony, published in Krakow in 1946, is the only extensive and detailed account that exists from inside the camp. There is no comparable source for Belzec. His text is rough, direct, without rhetoric. He describes the moment when the doors of the chambers were opened after a session and the bodies fell outward like a collapsing wall. He describes the work of separating intertwined bodies. He describes the forced dentists working with pliers beside the pits. He describes the faces of the guards, the names of some of them, the shifts, the times, the routine, because it was a routine. That is what Reder communicated, not as a moral revelation, but as a simple description of what happened. Extermination at Belzec was an industrial routine. It had schedules. It had personnel assigned by function. It had verification procedures. It had lunch breaks. The permanent staff of the camp was never large. During its period of maximum activity, Belzec had between 20 and 30 SS members and between 80 and 120 Ukrainian auxiliaries from Troniki. With that staff, on its busiest operating days, the camp processed between 6,000 and 15,000 people. The disproportion between the number of direct perpetrators and the number of victims was only possible because of the design of the process. The system was built so that the work of killing did not require each guard to kill individually. The initial commandant was Wirth, who remained at Belzec until August 1942, when he was promoted to inspector of the 3 Operation Reinhard camps. His successor as commandant was Gottlieb Hering, who took over the camp during its stage of greatest operational efficiency. Wirth's new position, joint supervision of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, gave him a unique perspective on the entire chain. He traveled between the 3 camps, assessed performance, suggested technical improvements, and resolved logistical bottlenecks. In August 1942, Kurt Gerstein arrived at Belzec as part of his duties within the SS, connected to the supply of disinfection materials. Gerstein was an SS officer and worked in the hygiene department. What he witnessed that day made him one of the few members of the organization who attempted to alert the outside world to what was happening, although his efforts failed almost completely during the war. His report, written clandestinely and later passed to diplomats and religious authorities, describes the arrival of a train carrying thousands of people from Lvov. It describes the unloading. It describes the tube. It describes the wait in front of the chambers, with the engine failing for nearly 3 hours before the gas began to flow. It describes the people standing inside the chambers, packed so tightly they could not move, for the entire time the engine took to start working. It describes the minutes that followed, once the engine was running, and the sounds from inside. It describes the work of the Sonderkommando afterward. Gerstein entrusted his account to a Swedish diplomat named Goran von Otter on the train back to Berlin that same night. Von Otter passed the information to his government. The Swedish government did nothing decisive with it. Gerstein also tried to contact religious representatives. The report finally reached Allied hands after the war, when Gerstein was already under arrest. He died in a cell in Paris in July 1945, before trial, in circumstances that were never fully clarified. The summer of 1942 was Belzec's most intense period of operation. In July and August came the trains from the Lvov ghetto, one of the largest cities in the general government, with an enormous Jewish population. Trains came from Przemysl, from Rzeszów, from Tarnow, from Jaroslaw, from dozens of towns and villages in the Krakow district and the Galicia district. The camp's pits filled faster than expected. The management of corpses became the main operational obstacle. From the point of view of those responsible for Operation Reinhard, the problem was not moral, it was technical. The open pits generated odor. The odor spread. It alerted the Polish population in the surrounding area. The soaked earth began to contaminate the groundwater. The problem had to be solved. The solution was developed within the framework of Action 1005. The Nazi program intended to destroy the physical evidence of mass murder. Paul Blobel, an SS officer specialized in cover-up operations, had developed methods for exhuming and burning bodies on open-air pyres. The method was also applied at Belzec in late 1942 and during the first months of 1943. Tens of thousands of bodies were exhumed, burned, the bones crushed, and the ashes reburied or scattered. The objective was to erase the physical evidence of the scale of the extermination. While that process of erasure was being carried out, the number of new arrivals at the camp declined. By December 1942, most of the Jewish population of southeastern general government had been murdered. Those who remained in some residual ghettos would be liquidated within months. The function of Belzec, in terms of the program that had created it, was practically fulfilled. The camp began to be systematically dismantled. The gas chambers were demolished. The reception facilities were torn down. The remaining pits were covered. A farm was built on the site, with a Ukrainian installed as caretaker to give the place an appearance of normality. The tube, the wires, the barracks, the platforms, everything disappeared beneath earth and new wood. In the spring of 1943, if someone had passed by that land without knowing what it had been, what they would have seen was just another field on the Polish plain, with a house, with a man living in it, with crops in the soil. Chaim Hirschman was 30 years old when he arrived at Belzec. He survived because he was assigned to the Sonderkommando, like Redder, and because in December 1942, when the camp began to be dismantled and the Sonderkommando was liquidated to eliminate witnesses, he managed to escape during the transfer. He reached Krasnik, hid under false papers, and survived the war. In March 1946, he was located by the Jewish Historical Commission in Poland, the organization created by survivors to document the crimes. He agreed to give testimony. The first session was held on March 19th. Hirschman spoke for hours. He described the arrival at the camp. He described the process. He described the Sonderkommando. He described the names of some guards. He described the internal organization. At the end of the session, the interviewers agreed with him to continue the next day. On March 20th, 1946, Chaim Hirschman was murdered in his home. He was killed by a member of a post-war Polish anti-Semitic group. His testimony was left interrupted, incomplete, with the second part never spoken. The commission preserved what it had. It is one of the most valuable and most truncated documents in the entire historical record of the Holocaust. Rudolf Raeder survived in Belzec for a reason he himself described as a mixture of useful work, invisibility, and luck. He was older than most of the men in the Sonderkommando. He had a trade. He knew how to make things with his hands. The gods used him for maintenance and fabrication tasks. That kept him away from the most dangerous shifts, those most directly tied to the extermination process, where rotation was faster to prevent prisoners from accumulating too much knowledge of the whole system. In November 1942, Raeder was sent to Lvov with an SS guard to buy materials for the camp. It was the first time he had left the installations since his arrival. When the guard entered a shop and left him waiting in the street, Raeder simply walked away. He walked. He did not run. Walking was what people did. Running would have drawn attention. He kept walking until he was far away. He found refuge. He survived the war hidden in Lvov with the help of a Polish woman named Stanisława Leszczyńska. After the war, he published Belzec, his account. He wrote it in Yiddish. It was translated into Polish. It took years to reach the international academic world. Decades later, when historians began reconstructing Belzec with greater rigor, Raeder's text became the skeleton on which much of the existing knowledge was built. The other confirmed survivors are names tied to fragmentary testimonies, post-war documents, and mentions in secondary sources. One of them, Yom Tov Levitt, escaped in 1942 and spent the rest of the war on the run. Another, Israel Goldberg, survived the liquidation process of the Sonderkommando and lived under a false identity. Their testimonies are shorter, more incomplete, intersecting with those of Raeder and Hirschman at points where they overlap, diverging in details that cannot always be verified against one another. 7 in total, out of 430,000. The scale of Belzec can only be understood in relation to the time it took to produce it. The camp operated actively for approximately 9 months. During that period, The average murder rate was between 45,000 and 50,000 people per month. That equals between 1,500 and 1,600 people per day. On the busiest days, in August 1942, when the trains from Lvov arrived, the numbers exceeded 10,000 in a single day. To place that figure in physical context, the camp occupied just under 10 hectares. The space available for pits during the first phase of operation was limited. Problems of space were constant. SS engineers made calculations about the possible burial density per cubic meter. Those calculations exist in documents captured after the war. They are documents written with the technical neutrality of a civil engineering report. The bureaucratic language surrounding Belzec in the German archives is consistent with that neutrality. The word used for extermination was resettlement. The Jews were not murdered, they were resettled. The trains that transported them were described as special trains. The gas chambers were hygiene facilities. The Sonderkommando was the special work unit. Every function in the process had its administrative euphemism. The language was designed not to deceive those who used it, who knew exactly what each term meant, but to build a layer of bureaucratic distance between the action and its name, between the fact and responsibility. That distance also became, after the war, one of the instruments used in the defense of those who were tried. Lower-ranking perpetrators argued that they had only carried out bureaucratic orders, that the documents they signed described resettlements, that they could not know, from their specific functional position, what happened at the end of the process. The language they had built to operate the camp became a legal argument. Operation Reinhard, the name the Nazis gave to the extermination program of which Belzec was part, was named in honor of Reinhard Heydrich, assassinated in Prague in May 1942. A few months after chairing the Wannsee Conference. The program included the 3 extermination camps of the general government, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Together, during the operational period that stretched from the winter of 1941 to the autumn of 1943, the 3 camps murdered approximately 1,700,000 people. Most were Polish Jews. Some were Jews deported from other European countries. Belzec was the first to begin operating and the first to close. Its 9 months of intense activity place it, in terms of speed of extermination, among the deadliest structures that have ever existed. Not because of the total number, which in absolute terms is surpassed by Auschwitz-Birkenau and Treblinka, but because of the proportion between active time and number of dead, and because of the almost total absence of infrastructure for any function other than killing. Treblinka took a little more than a year to match Belzec's numbers. It had more space, more personnel, and more developed logistics. Auschwitz-Birkenau operated for years and had, among its multiple functions, that of a labor camp, which meant it kept a population alive for extended periods. Belzec did not have that function. Belzec was only what the Nazis called an annihilation camp, in its purest and most concentrated form. That functional purity is also why there is so little documentation generated from inside the camp. In Auschwitz, thousands of prisoners survived long enough to observe, memorize, write in secret, and communicate. In Belzec, the passage from arrival to the chamber lasted hours. There was no time for anything. The design of the camp eliminated time as a variable. Odilo Globoknik supervised Operation Reinhard from his headquarters in Lublin throughout its duration. After the war, he attempted to flee toward the Austrian Alps. He was captured by a British patrol in May 1945 in the Mole Valley, in Carinthia. When the soldiers identified him, he took his own life by biting into a cyanide capsule he had hidden in his mouth. He died on the spot. Christian Wirth was killed in an ambush by Yugoslav partisans in May 1944, while supervising anti-partisan operations in northern Italy. He was shot from the side of the road. He died instantly. Franz Stangl, who had been commandant of Sobibor and later Treblinka, both camps in the same operation as Belzec, managed to flee to Brazil after the war with the help of an escape network known as the Rat Line. He lived in Sao Paulo under his own name for years. He was identified and extradited to Germany in 1967. He was tried and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1970. He died in prison in 1971. One day after giving a long interview to journalist Gitta Sereni, in which he described, with a clarity more disturbing than any evasion, how he had learned not to think about the people who passed through his camps. Of the commandants and senior staff directly involved in Belzec, the vast majority were never tried. Some died during the war, others escaped. Others reinvented themselves as ordinary citizens in post-war Germany and lived into old age. In 1963, at the court in Munich, the only trial specifically focused on Belzec personnel began. Several men were investigated. Most were acquitted or received minor sentences for lack of individualized evidence. The main difficulty faced by prosecutors was the same one the perpetrators themselves had created. The camp had been designed to leave no survivors who could testify against specific individuals. The documents had been destroyed. The installations had been erased. The terrain had been altered. The testimonies of Raeder and Hirschman, which mentioned names, faces, and concrete actions, were among the few pieces of direct evidence available. And the post-war German judicial system required, for a conviction, proof of direct individual authorship, not merely participation in a system. That legal standard had a decisive effect. It allowed most of the personnel of the Operation Reinhardt camps never to answer before any court. The history of what happened to the Belzec site after the war is, in many ways, as revealing as the history of the camp itself. During the first post-war years, the place was almost ignored by the Polish authorities. The farm built over the pits was still there. The farmer installed by the Nazis continued to live there for several years. The people of the village of Belzec knew what had happened. Some had seen the trains arrive. Some had smelled what came from the camp. Some had picked up objects that appeared in the surrounding fields: documents, shoes, clothing, photographs. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Polish communist regime had no interest in commemorating the specifically Jewish destruction. The official narrative was that of Polish martyrs in general, a narrative that included Jews only insofar as they could be integrated into the broader category of victims of German fascism, without particularizing the genocidal nature of their extermination. Belzec had no clear place in that narrative. In 1963, a small commemorative stone was placed on the site, without a clear inscription, without sufficient signage, without access infrastructure. The place did not appear in historical guides. There was no public transport oriented toward the memorial. Survivors who wanted to visit had to arrive by their own means at an almost unmarked site to mourn over flattened earth. Rudolf Raeder went to the site once, in the 1950s. He found nothing he recognized. Everything had been moved, covered, planted. He walked across the field until he found a point where the earth yielded slightly more beneath his feet, where there was something different in the consistency of the soil. He knelt down. He said he could feel it, that the earth was not the same. He lived until 1977. He died in Montreal, where he had emigrated after the years he spent in Krakow. He was 96 years old. The archaeological problem of Belzec was not addressed scientifically until the 1990s. When researchers from the Council of Museums of Poland and the American Jewish Committee began the first systematic studies of the terrain, what they found confirmed the scale of the crime. The pits were distributed in a way that could only be understood if one knew the chronological functioning of the camp. The oldest, those from the first phase of operation, were the deepest and densest. The later ones, dug when available space had shrunk and urgency had intensified, were shallower. Some contained remains of the bodies exhumed and burned in 1943. Others contained remains of those not fully reached by the process of evidence elimination. Soil analyses confirmed the presence of phosphorus, calcium, and other biological compounds in concentrations far above normal in the camp soil and in a perimeter strip several meters wide. The earth of Belzec is different in its chemical composition from any surrounding soil. It still is today. During the planning of the memorial, a debate emerged that lasted for years. How to commemorate a place where the ground itself is a mass grave, where any major excavation means directly disturbing the remains of the victims. The solution adopted was to cover the entire site with a layer of molten black metal slag, sealing the ground without piercing it. The visual effect is that of a cauterized wound, a black field, dense, still, where nothing grows and nothing can grow. The memorial opened in 2004. It bears an inscription speaking of those who died there. The inscription does not try to explain. It offers no classroom context, no genealogy of horror. It only names the number and the place. There is one aspect of Belzec that historians have repeatedly pointed out, and that tends to be lost in the broader narrative of the Holocaust: the speed with which it was forgotten, even by those who knew of it. At Nuremberg, in 1945 and 1946, Belzec was barely mentioned in the main trials. The focus was on the broader concentration camp system, on conventional war crimes, on the planning of the war. The Operation Reinhardt camps, which had murdered almost 2 million people, received far less attention than Auschwitz, which survived as a captured installation and whose prisoners, liberated by the Red Army on January 27, 1945, were able to testify in large numbers. The Operation Reinhardt camps had been deliberately destroyed. Their victims were buried or incinerated. Their survivors could fit inside a single small room. That asymmetry in available evidence translated into a historical asymmetry that took decades to begin correcting. The work of Yitzhak Arad, who in 1987 published Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, The Operation Reinhardt Death Camps, was the first exhaustive academic study of the three camps in a single volume. Until then, detailed knowledge of Belzec had been scattered across monographs in Yiddish and Polish, archival documents that few researchers had systematically consulted, and the testimonies of the few survivors, of which only Reders had been widely published. Arad's work coincided with a generation of Holocaust historians who were beginning to distinguish more carefully between the different types of installations in the Nazi system. Concentration camps, where prisoners lived and worked until they died from exhaustion, hunger, or execution. Extermination camps designed exclusively for killing, and mixed camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, where both functions coexisted. That distinction mattered because it illuminated something fundamental. Extermination in the Operation Reinhardt camps was not a byproduct of the concentration camp system. It was the system itself, stripped of every other function. The railway line that passes beside the Belzec site is still in use. It is the same line, or one built along the same route, that the convoys used between 1942 and 1943. The trains that pass through the area do so a short distance from the memorial. Travelers looking through the window see the black field, the commemorative installation, the plaque. If they know what it is, they know. If they do not, they see only a strange construction in a flat landscape. That proximity between ordinary space and marked space is part of the geography of extermination in Poland. The Operation Reinhardt camps were not in remote places. They were embedded in the country's everyday infrastructure network. Belzec is a village with a railway station, shops, named streets, houses with gardens. The camp was only a few meters from the center of the village. The people who lived in that village in 1942 could not know, on some level, what was happening. The smell reached the houses on windy days. The sound of the trains, the different rhythm of convoys that stopped and left again more quickly, was perceptible to anyone living with attentive senses. Part of recent historiography on Operation Reinhardt has focused precisely on that question. What non-Jewish Poles living nearby knew. In the villages, in the towns that saw the convoys depart, at the stations where the trains made technical stops before reaching the camp. The answers are complex and cannot be reduced to a simple narrative. There was genuine ignorance in some cases, geographical distance in others, fear in many, indifference in some, and active complicity in others. The scale of the extermination required, in order to keep moving, that a very large number of people in very different positions continued doing what they did without intervening, without warning, without resisting. That inertia of non-action is also part of the mechanism. The children who arrived at Belzec went with their mothers. That was the protocol during the initial separation on the platform. Males older than 12 or 14 were directed to the men's side. Younger children remained with the women. There were mothers who lied about their sons' ages to keep them with them. There were mothers who handed their babies to women already separated from their families, hoping that being without children might give them some chance of being selected for work. Most of those strategies changed nothing. Selection for work at Belzec was minimal. The camp did not need workers in large numbers. The only people spared on arrival were those with a clearly useful trade for the functioning of the camp's own infrastructure. Small children entered the chambers, carried in their mother's arms or holding their hands. That image, which Reader mentions in his testimony without elaborating more than necessary, is one of the most persistent in the documentation of the camp. It is not an image that requires explanation. It is simply what happened. The hair cut from women before they entered the chambers was collected, packed, and sent to Germany. It was used to make industrial textiles, stuffing for mattresses and other materials. The money deportees carried, and that was confiscated in the reception area, was counted and sent to the Reich Treasury. Valuables were catalogued. Gold from teeth was melted into bars. The economy of extermination at Belzec as in all Operation Reinhardt camps, operated according to a logic of total extraction. Every centimeter of material value that could be extracted from the victims was extracted. The program's archives contain invoices, delivery notes, shipping records, tons of clothing, thousands of kilos of hair, millions of Reichsmarks in cash and objects. The documentation of that economic flow was one of the strongest elements of evidence in the post-war trials, precisely because those responsible had recorded it with accounting meticulousness. In the final months of 1942, when the pace of deportations began to decline because the target communities had been almost completely destroyed, the camp personnel began to sense that the end was approaching. Not the end of the war, but the end of that place's specific function. Some guards requested transfers. Some SS members began drinking more alcohol than usual. Post-war testimonies from people who knew them during that period described them as men who had absorbed something difficult to name, a kind of internal noise that did not disappear when the shift changed. There is no evidence in those descriptions of remorse in the conventional moral sense. What some expressed was something closer to exhaustion after performing work that required the constant suppression of certain mental reflexes. The work of killing on an industrial scale, even when fully bureaucratized and distributed among multiple specialized functions, produces something in the people who do it. Not always what one expects it to produce, but it produces something. Himmler, aware of that problem, had given instructions that the personnel of the extermination camps receive extra rations of alcohol, frequent leave, and access to recreation. Not because he was concerned about the well-being of his men in the ordinary sense, but because men who collapsed psychologically were an operational problem. Performance dropped. Errors increased. The secrecy of the operation was compromised when a man carrying the weight of what he had done began to speak in the wrong places. During the war, secrecy was the most fragile element of the entire operation. Millions of people knew or suspected something. The trains crossed cities and villages. SS couriers spoke with their families. Polish workers hired around the camps for auxiliary services observed and talked. The secret was maintained not because it was airtight, but because the power structure surrounding it made breaking it too costly for too many people. The liquidation of Belzec's Sonderkommando, the group of forced prisoners who had operated the camp from within, began when the camp was already in the process of closing. It was the most delicate part of the dismantling. These men knew too much. They had seen everything. They had been forced to participate in everything. For the SS, their existence was the greatest risk of leaks. The method was a transfer. They were told they would be taken somewhere else to continue working. Some understood what was going to happen during the journey and tried to escape. Most died in that operation or were recaptured in the following days. Of the men who made up the Sonderkommando in that final stage, almost all were murdered. The few who survived did so through variants of the same formula. Jump, run, hide, find help, change identity, wait. Rieder escaped weeks before that liquidation, during the trip to Lvov. Hirschman escaped during the closing and transfer process. The other survivors did so at different moments and under circumstances that the historical record has not been able to reconstruct fully in every case. After the liquidation of the Sonderkommando and the beginning of systematic dismantling, the camp remained in the hands of a reduced group of guards and specialists who supervised the process of erasure. By the summer of 1943, the dismantling phase was practically complete. The last trucks left. The farm remained in place. The earth was flattened. There is a moment in Rader's testimony that is often cited because it condenses something that more elaborate accounts sometimes fail to capture with the same economy. He describes it without special emphasis, almost as a side note, while speaking of the morning routines in the camp. He says that the guards arriving for the day shift greeted those from the night shift, asked whether everything had gone well, whether there had been problems with the engine, whether the Sonderkommando had fulfilled the pit quota. They drank their coffee. They talked about the weather. One complained that it was cold. That normality of everyday gestures within industrial horror is what Rader's testimony conveys most effectively. Not because Rader sought any literary effect, but because that was what he had seen. The coffee, the cold, the pit quota, all in the same sentence. The camp functioned with the regularity of any other industrial installation. The problems solved were technical problems. The decisions made were logistical decisions. The language used to speak about the work was the language of work. And at the end of the shift, the guards who had spent the day supervising the extermination process returned to their barracks, ate dinner, and slept. In statistical terms, Operation Reinhardt was the most temporally concentrated element of the Holocaust. Between the spring of 1942 and the autumn of 1943, the three camps murdered more people in less time than any other structure in the Nazi extermination system. Belzec had the shortest operational life and the lowest survival rate. Auschwitz survived as a camp until January 1945 and liberated tens of thousands of prisoners. Treblinka was partially destroyed by a prisoner uprising in August 1943 and closed shortly afterward. Sobibor was the scene of another uprising in October 1943, after which it too was closed. Belzec had no uprising. By the time the camp liquidation process began, the prisoners' capacity for collective resistance had been reduced to almost zero by the very design of the system. The number of people alive in the camp at any given moment was minimal. For the vast majority, life inside the installations lasted hours. There was no communication structure among prisoners. There was no possibility of organizing anything. The uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibor were possible because those camps had a prisoner-worker population large enough and stable enough over time to establish networks of trust, obtain weapons, and coordinate action. In Belzec, those minimum conditions almost never existed. The name Belzec as a place has its own history, independent of the extermination camp. The village had existed for centuries before the Nazis arrived. It had a Jewish community that also predated the German regime. In 1942, that community was murdered in the same camp that had been built within its municipality. The place name Belzec appears in SS archival documents, not as the name of a place, but as the name of a function. The convoys went to Belzec the way they might go to a warehouse, a depot, a processing point. Geography was reduced to function. After the war, the village once again became just a village. The inhabitants who lived there during the camp's operation grew old. Some spoke. Many did not. The story of what each person who lived meters from the pits knew, when they knew it, and what they did with that knowledge, is a history that historiography has only partially explored. With the limited tools of oral memory and the few written records available, what is documented is that the smell during the most intense months of operation reached the village, that the nearest residents saw the trains, that some Poles, during 1942 and 1943, helped Jewish fugitives, that others handed them over. That most did what most people do when fear and uncertainty define the environment. They waited for it to pass. The historical recognition process of Belzec was slower than that of other camps for reasons connected both to the lack of survivors and to the politics of memory in communist and post-communist Poland. The Museum Act of 1947 protected the camps that the Polish state had decided to commemorate. Auschwitz and Majdanek, captured installations with structures still visible, had that status from the beginning. The Operation Reinhardt camps, which had been deliberately destroyed, took decades to enter the official system of memory. In Poland, during the 1950s and 1960s, speaking specifically about the Jewish extermination was politically uncomfortable in complex ways. Post-war anti-Semitism in Poland was real and documentable. The Kielce pogrom in 1946, in which 42 Holocaust survivors were murdered by a Polish mob, was the most visible episode of a broader and more diffuse violence. In that context, the specifically Jewish memory of extermination and the Polish memory of the same period existed in separate spaces that did not always communicate well. Yad Vashem, in Jerusalem, the Israeli Authority for Holocaust Remembrance, began documenting the Operation Reinhardt camps from its early years in the 1950s. But its influence on memory politics in communist Poland was limited. The connection between international academic research and official Polish recognition of the site took time to emerge. The debate over whether and how to archaeologically excavate the Belzec site was one of the most complicated faced by the memorial construction process. On one hand, archaeological research could provide precise data about the distribution of the pits, the number of victims, and the chronology of extermination. On the other hand, Jewish tradition prohibits disturbing the dead. The religious leaders of the Jewish communities consulted were clear. The ground should not be deeply excavated. The dead had to remain where they were. The solution of covering the soil with a layer of metal slag was, in part, a response to that imperative. The memorial seals and preserves without digging or disturbing. It acknowledges the presence without unearthing it. The visitor walks over a surface that covers the pits without being able to forget. Because the entire design of the space prevents forgetting, what lies beneath. The archaeologists who worked during the preliminary phase of the memorial in the 1990s conducted limited probes, soil studies, and analyses that made it possible to map the approximate extent and distribution of the pits without fully opening them. That map, published in academic studies, is one of the few direct visual representations of the camp's internal geography available today. The pits are stains on a topographic map, areas of different density detected by instruments and probes. Beneath each stain, bodies. Yitzhak Arad, the historian who wrote the first complete study of the three camps, was himself a Holocaust survivor. He had survived as a partisan in the Belarusian forests during the war. When he came to write about Belzec, he did so from a position that was not that of a clinical historian observing the object from a neutral distance. It was that of someone who knew the period from within, who had lost family, who had lived inside the same system of terror he described. That dual position of survivor and scholar was for decades one of the driving forces behind the historical rescue of Belzec. There was no institution with enough structural interest in documenting a camp with few survivors and no visible installations. It was the personal commitment of specific individuals, many of them survivors or children of survivors, that kept the research alive. The generational shift that occurred from the 1980s and 1990s onward, when younger historians who had not lived through the period began working with the archives using new methodologies, expanded the work without changing its essentially restorative character. It remained, in many ways, the work of recovering what had been designed not to remain. The question that reappears in almost all literature on Belzec, formulated in different ways and answered in equally different ways, is the question of knowledge. Who knew? How much? Since when? How it was possible for a process of that scale to remain relatively hidden while it was happening, and for decades afterward. The strongest answer historians have built is that knowledge existed in multiple forms and levels without producing effective intervention because the conditions for that intervention were not present. The BBC broadcast reports about mass extermination in Poland from late 1942. The Allied governments had information. Reports from the Polish resistance reached London. The problem was not primarily informational. It was political, logistical, and tied to the priorities of conventional war. On the German side, the general level of public knowledge about the extermination of the Jews is a subject historians have debated intensely. Different studies have argued that knowledge was more widespread than post-war Germany comfortably acknowledged. Letters from soldiers at the front to their families mentioned what they saw. Railway workers who drove the deportation trains knew where they were going. Officials who processed confiscated property knew where it came from. Knowledge, in that sense, was not a piece of information one either had or did not have. It was something distributed in fragments of different size and clarity across millions of people, in forms that allowed different degrees of recognition and different degrees of active suppression of that recognition. In Belzec's tube, the narrow corridor that led from the reception area to the chambers, there were guards along the sides. Their function was to keep the movement going. If someone stopped, if someone resisted, the guard beat or pushed them. The corridor was too narrow for anyone to turn around. The pressure of the bodies coming from behind prevented stopping. The physical design of the space produced forward movement by its own geometry, even before violence had to be used. That geometry of control which space exercised over the body was studied by the architects who designed the Belzec Memorial. In their project reflections, the problem emerged of creating a commemorative space that did not unintentionally reproduce the spatial logic of the camp. A memorial that directed the visitor too rigidly risked imitating, in its structure, the kind of control the camp had exerted over those who passed through it. The adopted solution was a space that guides without forcing, that suggests a path without imposing it, that opens perspectives instead of reducing options. The black field that covers the site has no single direction of movement. One can walk across it in different ways. One can leave it. That, in terms of the history the space carries, is not a minor detail. Rudolf Reder, in his testimony, once described the sound produced by the chambers during a session. Not the sound of the engine, which was separate, dull, and regular. The sound from inside the chambers. He said it was a sound that could not be compared with anything he had heard before or afterward, that it was a sound that did not stop until it stopped all at once, and that the silence that followed was different from any other silence. He did not elaborate further. He added no interpretation or explanation. He moved on to the next point in the account, which was the opening of the doors and the work of the Sonderkommando. That economy of testimony, which gives the fact without surrounding it, which names what happened without elevating it into a symbol of anything, is characteristic of many survivor testimonies. Not because there is an aesthetic rule dictating that tone, but because someone who has been there does not need the rhetoric of horror. The fact is enough. The fact is more than enough. The Belzec Memorial receives far fewer visitors each year than Auschwitz. That difference speaks to the place each camp holds in collective memory, to the circuits of historical tourism, to access infrastructure, and to the prior knowledge visitors have before they arrive. Those who go to Belzec usually do so by deliberate choice. It is not a place one visits in passing. It lies on a route that requires a detour. The village of Belzec does not have the tourist infrastructure of better-known memorial sites. Visitors arrive from nearby cities or from long routes. They park the car. They enter the memorial space. They walk over the black field. They read the names of the destroyed communities engraved on the perimeter wall. There are hundreds of names. Cities, towns, villages. The names of the places survived the people. Some visitors are descendants of families who lost someone in that place. They have no pit to point to, no name engraved on a gravestone, no specific date. They have only a black field and the name of a town of origin on the wall. In December 1942, while the camp was beginning to close and the farm was being built over the pits, a group of Jews who had managed to escape recent deportations in the region were hiding in the forests around the village. Some had information about what had happened to their families. Some did not know with certainty, but sensed it. All knew that returning to the towns from which they had fled meant death or denunciation. Living in the forests during the Polish winter of 1942, with minimal resources, was itself a threat of death. The cold, hunger, police groups patrolling in search of fugitives, the distrust or active hostility of some peasants in the area. Those who managed to survive the following months did so in conditions that later testimonies describe with the same dry economy Rita used to describe the camp. Fact after fact, without elaboration, because elaboration would have required a distance that did not exist. Some of those fugitives from the forests lived to see liberation. Some were captured before then. Their testimonies, when they exist, are fragmentary. They tell more about what it means to flee than about what Belzec was from inside, because Belzec from inside could only be told by those who had been there. In 1945, when the war ended in Europe, the scale of extermination began to become visible to the world in ways that had not been possible while the conflict continued. Images of the liberated camps, the living skeletons of Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, the ovens of Buchenwald, struck Western public opinion with a force no previous report had achieved. Those images became the visual reference point of the Holocaust for generations. The problem is that those images corresponded mainly to concentration camps in Western and Central Europe, not to the extermination camps of Eastern Poland. The concentration camps had survivors in large numbers. The pure extermination camps had been destroyed. What Allied soldiers' cameras could not photograph in the spring of 1945 was what had happened at Belzec, because Belzec no longer existed as a visible installation. There was only a farm, fields under cultivation, and, beneath the earth, what the earth keeps. That disparity between available image and the broader reality of extermination had lasting consequences for public understanding of the Holocaust. The iconography of the Holocaust was built on what had been photographed. What could not be photographed remained at the margins of popular knowledge, though not of historical knowledge. There is a detail that appears in several of the few testimonies connected to Belzec and has generated discussion among historians: the behavior of some members of the Sonderkommando during the extermination process. Men who had been doctors, teachers, merchants, were forced to participate in the mechanism that murdered their own neighbors, people from their own towns, sometimes members of their own families. The literature on the Sonderkommando, particularly at Auschwitz, where there are more extensive testimonies, has explored that situation carefully so as not to reduce it to the simple terms of collaboration or resistance. In Belzec, the scarcity of testimonies means that the question of the inner world of Sonderkommando members remains open in ways that will probably never be closed. Rader gives information about the work, about the procedures, about relations with the guards. He does not give, or cannot give, a complete psychological analysis of what it meant to live in that situation for months. What can be inferred from his text is that immediate survival required concentration on the present, preventing any broader processing. Doing the work he was ordered to do meant surviving that day. Not doing the work meant dying that same day. The margin of real decision was almost non-existent. That situation, which some have tried to describe as a moral dilemma, was in reality the almost complete elimination of the conditions that make a moral dilemma possible in the ordinary sense. A moral dilemma requires options between which to choose. In Belzec, the options were to die today or to die tomorrow, with the minimal possibility that something might change in the meantime. The Ukrainian auxiliaries from Chronological, the guards recruited from Soviet prisoner of war camps, occupied an uncomfortable position in the historiography and public memory of Eastern Europe for decades. Many of them had been Red Army soldiers captured by the Germans in the first months of the war. Conditions in the prisoner of war camps were deadly. Recruitment for the extermination camps was presented as an alternative to that slow death. Some accepted for reasons that included pre-existing anti-Semitism, others out of pure survival, others for both reasons. Their individual responsibility in the extermination is indisputable at the level of fact. They were the ones who maintained order on the platform, guarded the tube, and watched the chambers. Some participated directly in violence against the victims with a brutality that testimonies consistently describe. The complexity of their original situation, prisoners of war facing conditions of extermination, does not cancel that responsibility. Historiography has tried to hold that double truth without erasing either part. John Demjanjuk, one of the Chronological auxiliaries identified after the war, was tried in Israel in the 1980s as the guard known as Ivan the Terrible at Treblinka, sentenced to death, and then acquitted on appeal when it was determined that the identity was mistaken. He was tried again in Germany in 2011, this time for his proven role at Sobibor, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He died before the sentence became final. His case became one of the most legally debated because it tested the principle that participation in the extermination system, even when a specific act of killing could not be proven, was itself constitutive of a crime. Decades after the end of the war, the Polish government and various international institutions began moving toward the formal protection and commemoration of the Belzec site as a historical place. But the process was slow. For a long time, the land remained what it had been since the end of the war. A field with an insufficient sign, without adequate infrastructure, without complete interpretive material, without facilitated access. The real transformation came in the 1990s, when archaeological research began and when the memorial project started to take shape with the collaboration of Polish and Jewish institutions. The process was long, with debates about design, funding, and the content of the space. The memorial that finally opened in 2004 was the result of more than a decade of collective work. That collaboration was, in itself, a process of repairing damaged historical relationships. The 1990s in Poland were also a period of national debates about memory, responsibility, anti-Semitism, and post-war violence. The work on the Belzec memorial overlapped with that debate and was, in part, conditioned by it. The soil beneath Belzec's Black Field contains something that archaeologists, in their technical reports, describe with a vocabulary of strata, densities, and chemical compositions. It contains, in the terminology that is not found in technical reports, 430,000 people. The exact range varies depending on the source, between 430,000 and 500,000. The imprecision is not a lack of rigor, but a consequence of the fact that the camp kept no individual record of its victims. No one wrote down names upon entry. No one recorded identities. The precision the Nazi system applied to the accounting of confiscated goods did not extend to the human count of those murdered. The murdered were not names, they were volume. That volume was estimated by historians from deportation documents that survived in the archives of the communities of origin, from Deutsche Reichsbahn railway records listing the number of wagons and people per convoy, and from the available testimonies. The figure of 430,000 is the most conservative estimate and one of the most widely accepted academically. Some earlier sources gave higher figures. What is beyond dispute is the proportion between arrivals and survivors. 430,000 people entered, 7 survived. The black field covering the Belzec site does not reflect light the way normal ground does. It absorbs more. The slag from which it is made has a rough, dense texture that traps heat in summer and retains it in winter. On sunny days, the surface shines with a light that is not exactly bright but metallic, as though the metal below were showing through. Those who have visited the memorial in different seasons describe the space in ways that agree on one point: the color. The black is not a uniform black. It has degrees, textures, reflections that change with the time of day and the position of the sun. At noon in summer, the field gives off a heat that can be felt a few centimeters above the surface. At sunset in autumn, the field becomes absolutely dark, with no clear difference between its edges and the sky descending behind the trees. The visitor who walks across it, if alone, hears only his own footsteps, and the train passing, if it passes. Rudolf Rieder, after publishing his testimony in Krakow in 1946, lived for several years in Poland before emigrating to Israel and then to Canada. In Krakow, he returned to what he knew how to do: soap production. An occupation that in any other context would have been only an occupation, and that after Belzec was also, although he never explicitly said so in any text, a continuous reminder of what the SS had extracted from the victims. Whether that thought accompanied him in his Krakow workshop, no one knows. Rieder did not write it. In Montreal, where he spent his final years, he gave a few interviews. In all of them, he remained consistent with the tone of his original text: direct, precise, without rhetoric. A Canadian journalist who interviewed him in the 1970s later commented that speaking with him produced the same impression as reading his book, that the difference between the man and the text was minimal, that he seemed like a person who had decided, at some point after Belzec, that the only language he could use to speak about it was the language of facts. He died in 1977. The place where his remains lie is marked. Unlike the remains of the 430,000 people who surrounded him for 3.5 months in the camp, who are beneath the black field, where the train passes and the November sun falls over the metal slag and the earth is not the same.